Well, good evening. It's time to begin our class. If you'd like to go ahead and open up your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 5, 2 Samuel chapter 5. Oh, something happened here. There we go. All right, so last week we had a lot of stuff that we covered in looking at the transition from the tribe of Judah in the south and the 10 northern tribes as they were still divided, and the reunification of these two tribes after Saul has been killed on the battlefield with his sons, Abner and Ishbosheth, one of the sons of Saul, had been put into power as a king to rule the 10 northern tribes over a 7-year period. We find the civil war winds down to a critical battle at the Pool of Gibeon. And at that battle, then that transition then leads to this conflict between Ishbosheth and Abner himself. And then Abner becomes kind of incensed, and he decides, well, I'm going to turn everything over. I'm going to help David take control of all the tribes. So in this messages that come back and forth between the two, one, he wanted Michal back, his wife, that he had to leave when he took off fleeing. And then the other one, then he would meet with Abner. So that condition was met. Abner then goes and speaks to the tribes and the leaders, the elders of those tribes, and reminded them about the prophecies and such. And he even then speaks to the tribe of Benjamin. And the reason that's brought out is because, remember, King Saul, along with Ishbosheth, who was ruling those tribes at that time, they're Benjamites. So you need the Benjamite tribe as well to agree with this. And so they agree. Abner goes down, he meets with David, and in that meeting with David, it's peaceful. David agrees with everything. Abner goes to leave. Joab, the commanding general of David's forces, show back up after he's been gone, and he realizes, or he's been told, that Abner had been there and it had been a peaceful meeting, and he's very upset about that. So he tricks Abner, lures Abner back. Abner comes back, and then he murders him. And that sets off a whole nother little series of problems for David, because David had it all worked out. And, Abner was kind of going to be an instrumental character to be able to help David and bring and seal that reunification. And then he's murdered. So you can imagine in the northern tribes, this created a lot of distress, because now they were already very weakened. As it describes, David was growing stronger, they were growing weaker. And now they had agreed to join in, and they send Abner down as a messenger. And he gets down there. As far as they know, David could have had him murdered by Joab. So that just creates some more conflict spinning around David. David is looking very spiritually and looking at the bigger picture of bringing these tribes together. Anytime you have a civil war, you have to realize they're not just to be conquered and smashed and crushed in spirit, but you got to bring them back so that they won't have all of this type of anger towards one another and that continual possibility of rebellion between the different tribes. We had a civil war in this country in 1860s, and after the Civil War, our country went through some terrible years as well in trying to reunify ourselves. And we still have some of that residual going on today. We have some of that where, the North and the South, and we kind of play around with it. And there's some pride about the North or the South. And there was some bad political decisions and policies that were implemented. But one of the challenges that Abraham Lincoln was looking at was, how do you reunify? And how do you rebuild and reconstruct this nation back into one? And he knew that in order to do that, he had to be merciful to those in the South. And that didn't happen. And so there was a lot of terrible things that occurred and a lot of political decisions. And so I see the same type of a situation where David, as he is trying to reunify these tribes, realizing that these are family members. These are people that he is anointed to lead, and to lead as God's chosen king, but also realizing that they are God's people. That's something that David has never forgotten. He never forgets that these are God's people that he's leading, and he needs them all. He can't, take one tribe and just eliminate them. He's got to bring them all. So with the death of Abner, he had a truly remorseful response to his death. And it wasn't to try to put it on for show, but it was truly in honor of Abner and the horrificness of his death. And in that mourning and respectful burial and such, caused the elders of the tribes in the north to see David as truly genuine in his desire to reunify the tribes peacefully, as whatever agreement had been made with the other agreement that Abner had come and spoke with him. So they traveled down and they reunite. But before that occurred, we find that there's two brothers who decide that they're going to go ahead and carry through and remove this threat of a king or a future possible rebellion by killing Ishbosheth. And I think that I was talking to somebody after last week's class and talking about Ishbosheth's death, and it is kind of interesting because every one of these characters that are killed in an unrighteous way, the way David views Abner's death was an unrighteous death. It was not something that was condoned by God. He did not endorse it. And then with Ishbosheth, with the murder of him and them two men cutting his head off and bringing him down to David, and they think somehow that they're going to seek a reward, that they're going to be, maybe taken care of, in the future kingdom. And David responds right the opposite. And he reminds them of exactly when the Amalekite came to him and told him about King Saul's death and how he had killed the king. And he had him executed. And he said, "Do you think that I'm going to let you pass with this?" No. So he had them executed. And so all of these things were genuine. They're expressed by the writer in Samuel as something that it was something natural. It wasn't something played up by his PR advisor, his press secretary, and saying, "Okay, King David, I'm your press secretary, and we got to really we got to do some, spinning on this and try to make this right. So let's have a really big show of remorse, and then let's have a funeral for Abner. And then this way, the news, when it gets up there, it'll play really well with those northern tribes." That's not what we see. We see something that was very genuine. That was from, and the way he responded with Ishbosheth. Now remember, he made a covenant with Jonathan. And the covenant to Jonathan was that he would show kindness to the house of Saul. Now that's a dangerous promise, because when you try to maintain kindness to the dynasty that you're replacing, it is opening the doors for a lot of future problems. And that's why you find in historical, when you look at history of kings coming in and overthrowing the other king, is the first thing they do is they kill every drop of bloodline that they can get a hold of. If you're a second, third cousin, or somehow you could have any claim at all to power, or you have some form of respect of the populace and that they would support you, they kill you, because that new king did not want to have to sit around and look behind him all the time and worry about this rebellion that would rise up. And this is going to be something that David will have to deal with, because he doesn't go in and the remaining members of Saul's family and just eliminate them all. And there is some bad blood that kind of sticks around. And as we continue in this class, we'll get to see some of this rise up and come at him. But coming back to Ishbosheth and Abner, he really didn't want this to happen. So I kind of, you kind of wonder, well, it was a blessing. And I think that David deep down understood that it's probably a good thing. David is still a hardened warrior. Never forget that. As much as during this transition, you see him holding back, and not just unleashing the brutal force that he could have especially after the battle at the pool of Gibeon. After he defeated Abner, man, he could have just poured across the border and brought in full force, and he could have caused them to surrender unconditionally. He didn't do that. So, yes, he is remember, he killed 100 Philistines and took their foreskins. This is the same guy. So he is, like we keep saying, very complex. A man like that can write a beautiful psalm and perform with instruments and then turn around and kill 100 men and take their foreskins. And then you have this situation where this grander picture happening where he's been anointed king in Judah, but he still did not have the 11 northern tribes. So yeah, he's holding back. So when Ishbosheth is murdered, Abner's murdered, there's a part that genuinely he is sorry, because that is within his spirit. But at the same time, there's got to be a little bit of him going, because Abner could be a problem. But then he's got a Joab to deal with that is not a good man. He's an amazing commander. When I was talking to the person I was talking to after the class last week, we were talking, and it was like, if you were to compare Joab to somebody modern we could understand, it would be Patton, General Patton. That man, when it came to the battlefield, amazing. I mean, but you try to let him talk publicly? Oh, no. The man had no couth. He did not care. He just spoke it. And he caused a lot of problems, after the war in some of the statements he would talk about the communists and the Russians and stuff. So that's Joab. So he's still going to have to deal with the Joab as he goes along in this. So the murder of these two men was something that helped remove a threat, create an expression of honest who David is about to those northern tribe elders, and bring about the leaders coming down and them anointing him as king. And in their message, I thought it was very fascinating. I want to touch on that because a part of their message to him was the idea that, we know that while you were with Saul, that you went out and led the army. You were the leader of the military, and you took them out and you defeated the Philistines. So one of the things that you see is, what is their need? What are they seeking? Remember, when the Philistines invaded and they came into the northern tribes, King Saul was killed. They didn't just turn around and go home. They were still harassing and in that area of those northern tribes. So that was a continuous problem. That is a part of the message that Abner said in the reunification, that we know David is the guy that has been anointed by God, that he's going to deliver us from the Philistines. And the elders expressed that message. They also then expressed that they knew that he was the anointed. But something deeper was holding them from wanting to come and join him initially or immediately once Saul was murdered. And I think it was Abner. And I think also the chaos that was still reigning in the area because of Philistines. What was interesting as well, I want you to remember, is that in the tribe of Judah, there were no incursions coming in from the Philistines. Judah was sitting down there nice and happy. They were secure. Remember the relationship that he had with the Philistine king. So he's sitting there secured with the tribe of Judah, and the 10 northern are very chaotic and being harassed continually with the occupation of the Philistine army. So they're wanting relief. That's something they want. They want, first and foremost, get these Philistines out of our land so that we can have it back and we can have peace. So it was a little selfish, yeah, but at the same time, it was something that they were wanting. So now we have an anointment that has occurred from the northern elders. He was already anointed at the death of Saul by the elders of the tribe of Judah. That's the tribe that he is born from. And so that was a natural one that was going to occur. But now this anointment of the northern elders is in a recognition. Okay, now we submit as well. So now he has all of the tribes submitted. So now you have a situation where do you rule from? Where do I sit and rule? And that is a very important psychological decision on how you're going to be able to rule, I guess, with equity, and that people would accept the fact that you're not showing too much favoritism as well. So if we look at the map, we see that dividing line there that separated the two, and now it's gone, and so he's ruling down in Hebron, and then we know that Saul was ruling in Gibeon in the tribal area of Benjamin. But what's happened is now you have up at the very top, you can barely see the top, in Maccaneum is where Ishbosheth and Abner were ruling, and a lot of it had to do because the Philistines would not cross the Jordan and invade. They didn't, that was too much of a hassle. So Abner and Ishbosheth was able to retreat back over, and so they're further up. So you have these three geographical areas that have had the seat of power. Now, if you're of the tribe of Judah, he's our king. We would love to have him down here. But what's that going to say to all the other tribes? So this is going to be an amazing decision. And it's so awesome when you look, and that's what we're going to spend really the rest of this evening on, is looking at the selection that he's going to make when he moves the seat of power to Jerusalem. And I know that this is guided by the Lord. We don't have any scripture, and we're fixing to jump into the text in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6. We have nothing that says that he consulted with God, written wise. It says that David went to the priest and inquired of the Lord, where do I now place my capital and what city do I go to? But we do know that as soon as Saul was killed and he was coming in to go and rule Judah and was anointed, he did inquire of the Lord, which city do I go up to? And the Lord told him, go to Hebron. So when we read this text, and when he then makes the move to go and take Jerusalem, I am confident that we could say he inquired of the Lord, and the Lord told him to take Jerusalem. And if you look at this map, again, it is perfect. It really is. And we're going to look at some history of that. So in verse 6 of chapter 5, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites and the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking that David cannot come in. So as he approaches to take the city, now this is the hilly country. And if you recall, and we'll bring up some topographical maps that'll show kind of the relief and the elevation and the terrain there, but it was a very difficult city to take. One of the things about the Jebusites is that they are a part of the Canaanites. They're a part of the original group of people that had been ordered, removed to Joshua and on. But I want to look at this comment they say when they say, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off. Now this is where it gets interesting, because the rabbinical tradition, if you look up this from the Jewish historical point and the way their belief is, this idea here to them is that the lame and the blind and the blind and the lame were paganistic statues. And that there was also the idea that, and this is just tradition, there's nothing that really supports this, but it is kind of interesting, because there's two things we can look at when he says lime and blame, when the Jebusites. So if you look at the rabbinical point of view, the Jewish leaders' teachings is that the lime and the blame are reference to a covenant relationship between Abraham and the Jebusites. You remember he purchased some land for burial, and in that, this again is just a historical Jewish tradition or teaching, is that he made a covenant with them and they would not come in. Now, I don't know how they get this. Couldn't dig any deeper than this as far as like, how does this have to do with the blind and the lame? But somehow the the blind and the lame are Isaac and Jacob. I could not figure out how they picked who was who in this. The other thought, which I think is a pretty sound one to follow, is that this is a brutal insult verbally. That they are basically saying that our blind and lame would be able to repulse you. And so that was something they're thinking, that there's no way that they could come in. And you know, the Jebusites had good reason and good reason for confidence as such. If we go back to Judges 1:21, we see it written here about them that, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So, and also jumping over to Joshua 15:63, in the conquest of the land of Canaan, but the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. So they had good reasons to believe that David was never going to be able to take them out and remove them. They were not able to. Now, what is kind of interesting is that between the Judges and then this passage here in Joshua, if you look at the territory and you go in and dig, and there's very specific boundaries that are listed according to the inheritance of where each tribe geographically were to occupy as part of their inheritance. It's kind of questionable, you know, when it looks at what was Judah's, and then we find here saying Benjamites. So, but the point is, honestly, they've never been able to be thrown out. So the Jebusites have been there. There's a lot of archaeologists who have supported the idea, and scholars, that the Jebusites are a Hittite descendant. They're just another name for, you know, the Hittites. But again, they were among the people that the children of Israel failed to remove off the land. So here you have this little city here that nobody has occupied. No tribe has ever been able to be on. So that is a great place to go and take. It's also going to demonstrate that, yes, he is going to be able to take this place. So let's look at verses 7 and 8. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the lame and the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So this is where we find some words of describing the city that we're going to kind of parse out and really look at in more detail, because we see that two references to this geographical area. One is Zion, stronghold of Zion. The other one is city of David. Jebu is what they were calling, the Jebusites was calling that city. And so, you know, when we see that there was the ability to penetrate through the city, but it was a very obscure way that David, I don't know how he did, but being a military commander, if I was in charge, I would say, let's do some reconnaissance and go around and figure out how we can assault this city. And so it was kind of through stealth and sneaking up a water shaft that they were going to be able to penetrate that. And so he encourages that that's who is going to strike that. And so let's go ahead and read 9 and 10. And David, that's not the right one. Yeah. And so David lived in the stronghold, and he called it the city of David, and David built the city from Milo inward, and David became greater and greater for the word of the Lord, and the God of hosts was with him. I guess at the beginning of the class, I had it up here on Chronicles as well, that the challenge went out. Let me pull it up here. Chronicles 11, verse 4 through 9. When they go to take the city, in verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 11, verse 6, and they say they're going to take the city, David says to him, whoever strikes the Jebusite first shall be chief and commander. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, and he became the chief. So that's what I was looking for there, was the verse that talks about the challenge that was laid down to them. So sometimes I thought that was in there. That's when you start cross-referencing between the two. But that's really the only unique difference between the Chronicles record of taking of Jebus. So the word Jebus, that's the original city of David, Zion, Jerusalem, means threshing place. And it was just a place where I don't know exactly the origin of it, but these names all start to roll together when you start looking at the idea of this one particular location. Now remember, by the time that Jesus came, the actual original location of even what the city of David was dwarfed. I mean, it grew outside of the original size of the city that even David had conquered. So it was a place of threshing. And we're going to see that come up later on, something very important about that. And then the name Jerusalem comes from the word of teaching of peace. So we have the idea of Jerusalem. Zion, I thought, was an interesting name because, the way it says a parched place. And that's a reference as well we see in the New Testament and the Old Testament through the prophets talking about that this is a location in which that all this new beautiful gospel and this new reunification between man and God would start from, and that it would be a place of a new covenant, and it was going to bring a peaceful relationship between man and God. It also was going to be a place that was going to sift through and cause a sifting because of the Pharisaical attitudes and the Sadducees and stuff, and the conflict between that. And it was going to be a place that was going to start to sift through the hearts of men. So Salem, now we start to get to another point. A word that's used to reference this location is Salem, which means peace. Shalom, I'm not saying it correctly. I say Salem, but shalom, shalom, in the Strong's means peace. And that was probably the earliest name before even Jebus was listed, was the early name of Jerusalem was Shalom. Now, this is somebody that you're probably familiar with, a character early in Genesis 14 when Abraham was coming back after battling the kings who had captured Lot, and on his way back, we find this encounter that Abraham has with this Melchizedek, and he was king of Shalom, or Salem, as we would call it, either way, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. This is also the reference that is used in the Hebrews in establishing the priesthood of Jesus, because the same priesthood could not continue to exist, according to Aaron, under the new covenant relationship. So Jesus had to be a king and he had to be a priest. And so when they tried to say, okay, so how is he a priest now, and continuing that priesthood, it could not continue in the descendants of Aaron. And he was not a descendant of Aaron, he was a descendant of David, and David was a king. So check, there's the king, but where's the priest? And the Hebrew writer explains it, that it was Melchizedek, that he was the bloodline or the linkage back. Now, when did Melchizedek live? Well, he lived way before Mosaic timeline, way before the Aaronic priesthood was established. So this points out that there were people outside of the descendants of Abraham who had a righteous relationship with God. And it says he was a what? A priest to Yahweh, to the same God that they had. So these are the same location. This is the same location that David has just conquered. And there's another beautiful point here that comes up that I think is really amazing, is also Mount Moriah is this same grouping, the same area that is going to be the city of David and future growth, all Jerusalem as we know it. But look at this in Genesis with Abraham. In Genesis 22, verse 2, he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So in the land of Moriah, he was going to tell him, once he arrived in that region, which one of those mountains he was going to select. And so traditionally, and most scholars that I had researched and read believe that this was where it was at, was in those mountains, Mount Olive. So, again, as far as which mount of there in Jerusalem, but it does indicate that it is still that same location. Remember, all of these things that God has done has been to show us and to teach us. Paul said that all the things that were written before were written for our learning. God has always threaded some amazing, beautiful pictures that once we can take a look at and realize how marvelous it was. This location, going all the way back to Abraham, when he took his son up on the mount to then sacrifice him, becomes the same mount that then the Jebusites are sitting on, that where Melchizedek, after this sacrifice in this area here, that's where Melchizedek was also at. And all of this is pointing to the great significance, I think, of Mount Zion. And Mount Moriah talks about, it means in the Strongs, that it's chosen by Jehovah. So Zion, strong fortress. It's also a place of peace. It's also a place that is chosen by Jehovah. All those words, all those different descriptors that have referred to this very piece of real estate are all descriptors of things that God was fulfilling in order to bring us salvation. So let's go to the map and take a look and see. So this is a topographical map showing kind of the elevation and of the area. As you probably know by now, I love maps. So here is Mount Zion. And then across here is Mount Moriah. Bethel is over in this direction over here. So the city of David is going to be built around in this area here. On top here is the threshing floor that David is going to end up purchasing, and that where we see that the Temple Mount is located on this very top spot here. To this day right now, that's where the Temple Mount, the mosque, is sitting on. But this is where Solomon, as well, is going to build the first temple. This is just another look at what is described as the city of David, and get you a chance to kind of orient yourself. This supposedly is like a depiction of this huge stone here, where it's a millstone, where the angel of the Lord comes through, and as he's coming through and punishing the children of Israel because of David's sin, that David prays and he comes out and the angel of the Lord stops at this location. And then David ends up purchasing this. And so this is end up being where Solomon will build. This down here is the city that David has conquered, and it does get some expanded. I don't know the original, we don't know, but this is the house where David ends up living here. The tabernacle is not located here at this time. That's one thing that it's going to be moved, but at this time it's not there in the same location. But it's just, to me, I think it's amazing to look at some of this and see the Kidron Valley, see some of the different geographical locations. Today, you wouldn't even recognize if you've seen some modern pictures of this. Now, after he has taken the city, one of the things that's interesting is how that non-Jewish, non-tribes, other leaders outside the boundaries of the tribes of Israel have recognized and start to pay honor to David. In verse 11 of chapter 5, 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11, we read, "And Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel." So let's look at this. We have really I guess you'd call a pagan, a non-Hebrew king that is showing tribute to David. David sees this as being honored and reflecting and giving that as a sign coming from God that he has been approved and endorsed. Look at the things that he sends. And apparently that region used to be just full of beautiful trees and cedar trees and stuff in that area. But he doesn't just send him the materials. He's sending him carpenters, masons, and they build him a house. I don't know if, that's pretty amazing that you have a foreign king in this new startup kingdom to the south of you, and this new king who is vulnerable, instead of saying, let's attack them before they really get strong, he pays honor. He gives honor to David by building him a house. And David in verse 12 said, we read where the Lord, that's how he knew. He knew that the Lord had established him. And the other part of this as well, that he also understands that it's God who has exalted his kingdom. The kingdom that God has given to him, because God is blessing him, the nation's being blessed, but it's still for the people's sake of Israel. That sometimes people with attitudes that are very selfish, they would see this as completely as, you know what, I have accomplished a lot on my own, but this is very clearly a very important aspect that we see of David's character of being very spiritual and identifying who truly has brought me into this successful position I'm in. I think that's a lesson for us today as Christians too. Very often we see it, that it's a complicated thing, and we think that God is not necessarily in the picture. Jack says, I have seen it written that Hiram was the first king to recognize David as king. Yes, and this is the verse where you see the first nation to recognize David as king, which is probably pretty wise to go ahead and recognize him so that you're going to remain at peace with him. Now, this is the same city that many, many years later, from Nebuchadnezzar to Alexander the Great, is just going to lay waste to. But right now, they're in a relationship that's very positive with establishing this. So it's a good point. Hiram is the first king to recognize him and pay him tribute. So let's come back and do a little bit of genealogy and look at this, because we already had this list of the family in Hebron, and we saw the wives that he had. He had 6 wives. Now, Michael wasn't with him until the very end, but then all the sons that he had 6 sons while he was ruling in Hebron. But now when he comes into Jerusalem, the writer of Samuel brings up all of the other children that he has, and then he starts to bring up a whole bunch of concubines and wives, as the scripture will reveal, which I just don't. There's just a lot of discussion. If you want to, we can discuss it about the Old Testament wives, concubines, and such. If you want to pop some questions, I can address it later on. But it just shows the number of children that he's going to have as we go along. And it really just added a whole lot of complexity to the family dynamics, and is going to create a lot of problems later on. So really, that's what I've got for the class tonight. I would like you to, I'm giving some time so we could discuss the city of Jerusalem and the importance of that and some of those names. Or we'll have a short class tonight, maybe. So is Jerusalem an important city today? Is that a... It's kind of a trick question, isn't it? I just fascinated. I mean, I would love to travel there someday. I think that would be an amazing trip to go and to look and to see. And yeah, I mean, I think it would be awesome to see some of these. I think that, of course, it's very touristic now, a lot of tourism. Jack says it's definitely fraught with many geopolitical and religious debates and turmoil, and it's still even today. I mean, even if you think about the role that it's playing today in the geopolitical landscape, it's just amazing how this little spot, this little location, and that's why I think Moriah is so fitting, is that God has chosen. That God chose that spot to be a very significant place, going all the way back to Melchizedek. And then the same area where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. And then you find David, that place had not been occupied by any of the tribes. Nobody could defeat them. So it stayed unclaimed as part of the inheritance that they should have been able to take, never was able to take it. And then David comes and he's able to take that city back. And then from there on, it continues to show the importance of this city, Jerusalem. It's a city of peace, a city that is built upon a threshing floor, and a city, a stronghold, Zion. And then the prophets use the idea of how that it was going to be from Zion that it would flow out this beautiful message that was going to, bless all nations. And so you start in the Garden of Eden and you have that blessing given and that promise given to Eve. And then you follow all the way along, and then you see this little mention of Melchizedek, king of Shalem, and then it goes away, and then Moriah, Abraham, and then you come along and you see these Jebusites that are there, and then David taking and making it the city of David. And then as it continues to go along, then you see the temple being built by Solomon and it continuing to go, and just it continues to maintain this great important location to show a completion of prophecy. That was the purpose of it, was to also demonstrate, no matter what was going on, that God had promised, and that was a location that he had chosen, and he was going to show the fulfillment of it. And on the day of Pentecost, that's where you see that being fulfilled that the prophets had talked about, that it started in Zion. And then when the persecution started and becoming very severe, you see that it then spread out and started going from Zion out to all nations. And there's so many prophecies we could look at it and how wonderful that fits. And it had to come from Zion, Moriah, place where God had chose. And then we find the significant changes biblically after Jesus comes and the fulfillment of that location and the temple being destroyed. Jesus had prophesied that the temple would be removed. A whole new covenant relationship was starting. A whole new kingdom was established. And then you find that, like the Hebrew writer talks about, this heavenly Jerusalem, this place that was a heavenly one, a spiritual one that we are now citizens of, that now that is a location that is like the spiritual kingdom. So no longer is it a physical location like the same idea of the temple, the way that the temple now is each individual. The kingdom no longer was a physical one like it was with David, but it now is spiritual. The city of Jerusalem is the place of all of God's children and a great location. But historically, coming back to that, people who do not believe that the kingdom was established and believe in that, believe that there is going to be a time of this 1,000-year period where Jesus will come back down and then he will rule from Jerusalem. And so that has set forward this idea, the importance of Jerusalem, and that the temple will be rebuilt. And when the temple and sacrifices have been reinitiated, that will help to usher in this period that when Christ will come down and rule, and it has to come from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has always been, especially in the more recent centuries, a place that needed to be sacred in order to help bring Christ's rule in that kingdom that they don't believe has come. I believe it's come. I believe that there's a lot of scripture that shows that it has come and that it is a spiritual Jerusalem now that we are a part of with our citizenship in. But if you see that as that the kingdom has not come, then Jerusalem has become something extremely important to you, and you think and you believe that it has to be maintained in God's chosen in order to help bring that rule of Christ back. So even after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, for centuries afterwards, it became a place of pilgrimage. It became a place that was focusing around the Christian Crusades. We see that also then is Islam arising and then coming in as well and establishing a claim on it, as that's a sacred place for them too. And so it's continued to spin up and continue to this very day. One of the things I learned today that I was unaware of, because I haven't really researched it, but the Palestinians, the PLO, believe that their lineage goes to the Jebusites. Therefore, they predate the Hebrews in claiming Jerusalem. And I did not know that. And I thought, well, if you can actually link yourself, then I could understand that, because one of the thoughts I've always had is, the Israelis the Hebrews have a link to that land for thousands of years. But if you then can say, well, we're associated with the Jebusites, then you would predate even David. But there's a lot of historians, scholars, archaeologists that say, no, that's not a valid point, that it was somehow that the modern PLO Palestinian group is linked to the Jebusites. I don't know. I don't really know. But I thought that was an interesting point I wanted to kind of share with you. I'm still giving you some time to talk, and if you want to, interact here. Well, I'll wait just a little bit longer. I'm glad that you were able to join with us, and I hope that you got something out of this class tonight. If you have some comments about the class, something I said that might be wrong or inaccurate, I hope that you would, put it in the notes, put it into the chat, and I can check it out and respond to it next week. I hope that you will join me on Friday morning at 10 o'clock. Search for the Church as we go through the book of Acts. And then also 9:30 Sunday morning, we'll be having another Bible study. We're going through apologetics, Christian apologetics. And then, of course, worship at 10:45. And I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. All right. Well, good night. We'll see you. Bye. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine.